No one in the audience could have imagined what was about to happen. The game was moving along smoothly, the way it always did when families came prepared and the energy was right. The Thompson family, mother, father, 2 daughters, and a son, were playing against the Mitchells, and both teams were trading points back and forth in that perfect rhythm that makes for good television. Steve Harvey was in his element, cracking jokes, doing his signature reactions, making the studio laugh the way he'd done thousands of times before. But then he asked the question. Fast money. Final round. The daughter, Sarah Thompson, was at the podium, and Steve was reading from his card with that casual confidence that comes from decades of experience. Name something a husband does that makes his wife feel truly loved. It should have been simple, easy, the kind of question designed for quick answers and quicker points. But Sarah didn't answer right away. She stood there, her hand gripping the podium, and something flickered across her face, something that wasn't nervousness or uncertainty, but something deeper, something that looked like pain trying to wear a smile. "Take your time," Steve said gently, noticing the shift. Sarah's eyes moved from Steve to the audience, scanning the rows until they landed on someone in the 3rd section. 5th row. Her mother, Janet Thompson, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and hands folded tightly in her lap, watching her daughter with an expression that held too many emotions to name. And sitting next to Janet, his hand covering hers, was a man. Thin, too thin. The kind of thin that tells a story before anyone speaks a word. His face was pale, his eyes tired but alert, and he was wearing a baseball cap not for style, but for the reason people wear baseball caps when their hair has gone. Sarah's voice, when it finally came, was steady but quiet. "He stays," she said. "He stays even when it would be easier to leave." Steve's smile faltered slightly. Not because the answer was wrong, but because something in the way she said it made the studio feel smaller, made the air feel heavier. "He stays," Steve repeated softly, looking at Sarah with new attention. And then Sarah said the 3 words that would stop everything. "He's still here." The way she said it, not as an answer to the question, but as something else entirely. Something that sounded like gratitude and grief and defiance all wrapped into one, made Steve Harvey pause. Made the audience hold its breath. Made the cameras seem to lean in closer, sensing that what was about to unfold was bigger than any game. Steve's eyes followed Sarah's gaze to the audience, to the man in the baseball cap, to the woman whose hand he was holding. And in that moment, before anyone said another word, Steve Harvey knew. This wasn't about points anymore. This was about something that mattered more than television ever could. His name was Michael Thompson, 58 years old, high school history teacher for 33 years. The kind of man who remembered every student's name, who stayed late to help kids who were struggling, who believed that teaching wasn't just about dates and events, but about showing young people that the past could help them understand the present. He'd met Janet in college. She was studying literature. He was studying education. They'd both been broke, both working night shifts at the campus library to pay tuition, and somewhere between reshelving books and sharing vending machine coffee at 2 in the morning, they'd fallen in love. The quiet kind, the steady kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself with fireworks but builds itself brick by brick into something that lasts. They'd built a good life together. 3 children, Sarah, Emily, and Jacob. A house with a mortgage they'd finally paid off last year. Summer vacations to the same lake cabin they'd been renting since the kids were small. Thursday night dinners where everyone actually showed up. Phones put away, just talking. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing that would make headlines or trend on social media. Just a normal, beautiful, ordinary life held together by love and routine and the small daily choice to keep showing up for each other. And then, 18 months ago, Michael had started feeling tired. Not the regular tired that comes from grading papers until midnight or coaching the debate team. A different kind. The kind that sleep didn't fix. The kind that made climbing stairs feel like climbing mountains. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctor had said the words gently, carefully, but they'd landed like stones anyway. Michael had held Janet's hand in that sterile office and watched her face try to process what inoperable meant. What 6 to 12 months meant. What "will make you comfortable" meant. Sarah had been the one to suggest Family Feud. It was 3 months after the diagnosis, After the first round of chemotherapy that made Michael so sick he couldn't get out of bed for a week, after the conversations about clinical trials and experimental treatments and all the desperate mathematics people do when they're trying to bargain with death, Dad always loved that show. Sarah had told her mother one evening while Michael slept upstairs, his breathing labored even in rest. Remember how he'd yell at the TV when contestants gave stupid answers? Remember how he'd make us all play along during dinner? Janet had smiled through tears. He'd get so competitive. Let's apply, Sarah had said suddenly. Let's just try. Even if we don't get picked. At least, she'd stopped, unable to finish the sentence. At least we'll have tried something together. At least we'll have given him something to look forward to. At least we'll have one more memory before there aren't any more memories to make. They'd applied the next day, filled out the forms while Michael napped, wrote about their family, about their love for the show, carefully not mentioning the cancer because they didn't want pity. They just wanted a chance. When the call came saying they'd been selected, Michael had cried. Actually cried. Told Janet it was the chemo making him emotional, but they both knew better. It was hope. The smallest, most fragile kind of hope. Not hope that he'd survive, but hope that he'd get to do one more thing that mattered with the people he loved most. The taping was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Michael's doctor had been hesitant. That's a long time, he'd said carefully. Given the progression, I'll be there, Michael had interrupted, his voice firm in a way it hadn't been in months. Whatever it takes, I'll be there. And he was. Thinner than he'd been, weaker than he'd been, wearing a baseball cap to cover the hair loss and long sleeves to hide the bruises from repeated IV insertions. But he was there, in the audience, holding his wife's hand, watching his daughter stand at that podium, still here, still choosing them, still refusing to leave until he absolutely had to. And now, as Steve Harvey stood on that stage looking from Sarah to the man in the baseball cap, the entire studio began to understand what "he's still here" really meant, what it had cost, what it represented, how much love could be contained in those 3 simple words. Steve Harvey stood perfectly still. The microphone hung loose at his side, forgotten, as his eyes moved between Sarah at the podium and the man in the audience who was somehow both there and not there, present in body but already halfway to somewhere else, held to this moment only by sheer force of will and love. The studio had gone quiet in that way that happens when a room full of strangers suddenly becomes a congregation. Not the performative quiet of waiting for a punchline, but the sacred kind. The kind that understands something holy is unfolding, and the only appropriate response is reverence. "Sarah," Steve said softly, and his voice had changed. The entertainer had stepped back. What remained was just a man speaking to another human being who was carrying something too heavy. "Tell me about him." Sarah's eyes filled. She'd been holding it together, had promised herself she would, had promised her father she wouldn't cry on national television, that she'd just play the game and have fun and give him the memory he wanted. But Steve Harvey's voice, gentle and understanding and giving her permission to be honest, cracked something open inside her. "That's my dad," she said, and her voice broke on the word. "Michael Thompson. He's—" She stopped, swallowed hard, tried again. "He's the best man I've ever known. And he's dying." The collective intake of breath from the audience was audible. Someone in the back row gasped. A woman 2 seats from Michael covered her mouth with both hands. Steve's jaw tightened. He blinked rapidly, fighting his own tears, and when he spoke again his voice was barely above a whisper. "How long does he have?" "The doctor said weeks," Sarah answered. And now the tears were flowing freely down her face. "Maybe a month. They said he probably wouldn't—" She couldn't finish. Looked at her father, who was watching her with eyes that held so much love it seemed impossible one human heart could contain it all. Steve followed her gaze. Really looked at Michael Thompson for the first time. Saw the baseball cap, the gaunt face, the trembling hand that gripped his wife's like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to earth. And something in Steve's expression shifted, not pity, but recognition. The look of someone who understood that every family in that room would face this eventually, that love always ends in loss, that the price of caring deeply about another person is knowing you'll have to say goodbye. "Mr. Thompson," Steve called out, his voice carrying across the studio. "Can you stand up for me, sir?" For a moment, Michael didn't move, just looked at Steve with uncertainty, like he wasn't sure if he had the strength. But then Janet squeezed his hand, whispered something only he could hear, and slowly, so slowly, Michael Thompson rose to his feet. The audience erupted. Not polite applause, but thunderous, sustained, the kind that comes from people who need to do something with the emotion that's overwhelming them. They were on their feet, all of them, clapping and crying and bearing witness to this ordinary man who'd shown extraordinary courage just by showing up. Michael swayed slightly, steadied himself with one hand on the seat in front of him, and raised his other hand in a small wave. His smile was weak but genuine, and in his eyes you could see gratitude and embarrassment and something else, a kind of peace that comes from knowing you've spent your final days doing exactly what mattered most. Steve waited for the applause to quiet, and when it did, he turned back to Sarah. "When you said he's still here, that's what you meant. He stayed. He fought to be here for this." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. "How sick is he, Sarah? Tell me the truth." She took a shaky breath. "He can barely eat. He's in pain all the time, even with the medication. Getting dressed this morning took him an hour. The drive here..." Her voice cracked again. "The drive here from Oregon took 2 days instead of 1 because he had to stop and rest so many times. The doctors told us he was crazy to try, that he should be in hospice, that traveling would probably, but he came anyway." Steve finished quietly. "He came anyway," Sarah confirmed, "because he promised us. Because 30 years ago he took my mom on their first date to a taping of a game show in Los Angeles, and he's loved them ever since. Because when we were kids, Family Feud was our family thing. We'd gather around the TV every night it was on, and Dad would pause it after each question so we could all shout out our answers." She smiled through her tears. "He said he wanted one more night of that. One more chance to play together. One more memory to..." She couldn't finish. Steve Harvey turned to look at Michael again, and this time he didn't try to hide his own tears. They streamed down his face openly, unashamedly, and every person in that studio understood that what they were witnessing transcended entertainment. This was about the human heart in all its fragility and strength. About a father who'd given his children one final lesson in what love looks like when it's stripped down to its essence. Not grand gestures or eloquent speeches, but simply staying, being present, showing up even when every cell in your body is begging you to rest. "Mr. Thompson," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been doing this show for a long time. I've seen a lot, but I've never..." He stopped, composed himself. "I've never been more honored to have someone in my audience than I am right now to have you." Michael mouthed the words, "Thank you," but no sound came out. His face was wet with tears, his body trembling from the effort of standing, but he refused to sit down, refused to let this moment end before it was supposed to. Janet stood beside him, her arm around his waist, holding him up the way she'd been holding him up for 18 months, with fierce tenderness, with unwavering presence, with the kind of love that doesn't quit, even when quitting would be so much easier. Steve looked at the Thompson family, at Sarah still standing at the podium, at her mother and father in the audience, at Emily and Jacob sitting 2 seats over with tears streaming down their faces, and he made a decision. Not as a host, not as an entertainer, but as a human being who understood that some moments are too important to waste on games. He walked to the edge of the stage, sat down right there with his legs dangling over, and gestured for the Thompson family to come forward. "Forget the game," he said simply. "Come here, all of you. Right now." Sarah moved first, stepping away from the podium and walking toward the stage. Emily and Jacob followed, helping their parents navigate the aisle, supporting their father who could barely walk but refused to be carried. And as they gathered at the front of the stage, as Steve Harvey reached down to help Michael sit on the edge beside him, the cameras captured something that couldn't be scripted or rehearsed or manufactured. They captured truth. Steve put his arm around Michael's shoulders gently, carefully, aware that the man was made of pain and determination in equal measure. "How you feeling right now?" Steve asked softly. Michael's voice, when it came, was hoarse but clear, like the luckiest man alive. Steve's face crumpled. He pulled Michael closer, this stranger who'd become family in the space of 5 minutes, and the 2 men sat there on the edge of a stage while an entire studio wept. Not sad tears, or not only sad tears, but tears that came from witnessing the full spectrum of what it means to be human. The grief and the beauty, the loss and the love. The way endings and beginnings are sometimes the same thing. "You've given your family something," Steve said, his voice breaking. "You know that? You've shown them what it means to fight for the people you love. To show up even when it costs you everything. That's a gift, Michael. That's the kind of gift that lives forever." Michael nodded, too overcome to speak. His children had climbed onto the stage now too, gathering around their father, touching him, holding him, forming a protective circle around the man who'd built their world and was now preparing to leave it. And Steve Harvey, this man who'd made millions laugh, sat in the center of that circle and let himself break, let himself be moved. Let himself show 400 people in a studio and millions more who would eventually watch that it was okay to feel everything. That strength wasn't about holding it together. Strength was about being brave enough to fall apart when something mattered. "I want you all to know something," Steve said, looking at each member of the Thompson family in turn. "What you're doing right now, being here together, loving each other this hard, showing the world what family really means, this is going to touch people. People you'll never meet. People who are going through their own hard things. You're giving them permission to love fiercely too, to stay even when it's hard, to show up even when it costs everything." Janet Thompson, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke. Her voice was steady, strong in the way that comes from having cried every tear you have and finding you still have more. "That's what he's always done," she said. "Shown up. For 35 years of marriage, through good days and impossible days, he showed up. And he's showing up now. He's teaching us how to love someone, all the way to the end." The studio was destroyed. Grown men sobbing into their hands, women holding strangers. The crew, the cameramen and sound technicians and production assistants who'd seen thousands of episodes wiping their eyes and trying to keep filming through their own tears. And in the center of it all, Michael Thompson sat surrounded by his family, too weak to stand but strong enough to stay, proving that sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do is simply refuse to leave before love has said everything it needs to say. The game never resumed. Steve Harvey made that decision without consulting producers, without checking the schedule, without worrying about what it would mean for the episode or the ratings or the dozens of logistical concerns that usually govern television production. He simply decided, in that moment, that some things were more important than the machinery of entertainment. He sat with the Thompson family on that stage for nearly 40 minutes. The cameras kept rolling, but they felt less like instruments of broadcast and more like witnesses to something private being shared publicly, an invitation into grief and grace that the world desperately needed to see. Steve asked questions, not interview questions designed to extract sound bites or emotional reactions, but real questions, human questions, the kind you ask when you actually want to know someone. "Michael, what's been the hardest part?" Steve asked gently. Michael thought for a long moment, his breathing labored, his children's hands resting on his shoulders. "Knowing I won't see them grow old," he said finally. "Knowing I'll miss Sarah's wedding, Emily's graduation, Jacob's first real job." He paused, swallowed. "Knowing Janet will have to face all of that without me." Janet's hand found his, squeezed tight. "You'll be there," she said fiercely. "Maybe not the way we want, but you'll be there. You'll always be there." Steve turned to the children. "What do you want people to know about your dad?" Emily spoke first, her voice soft but steady, that he was never too tired to listen. Even now, even when he can barely stay awake if one of us needs to talk, he stays awake. He listens. Jacob added, "He taught me that being a man isn't about being tough or hiding what you feel. It's about showing up, about being honest, about loving people loudly enough that they never have to wonder." Sarah wiped her eyes. "He made normal things feel special. Tuesday night dinners, Saturday morning pancakes, driving us to school. He never acted like those moments were boring or beneath him. He treated every ordinary day like it was a gift." Her voice broke. "Because he knew. I think he always knew that ordinary days are actually the most precious ones." The studio had become a sanctuary. People weren't just watching anymore, they were participating in a collective act of remembrance, of honoring, of bearing witness to a life well lived even as it was ending. Strangers were holding hands. A man in the front row had his arm around his teenage son, pulled him close, whispered something that made the boy nod and cry harder. Steve Harvey looked at Michael Thompson, This ordinary man who was teaching an extraordinary lesson about what it means to love people all the way to the end, and he saw something that made his own heart break and heal simultaneously. Peace. Michael Thompson was dying, and he knew it, and he'd made his peace with it. Not because he was ready to go, you could see in his eyes that he wanted more time, wanted to stay, wanted to see everything he was going to miss, but because he'd done what he came to do. He'd loved well. He'd shown up. He'd given his family the gift of his presence right up until the very last moment he could. "Michael," Steve said quietly, "is there anything you want to say? To your family? To anyone watching? To the world?" Michael took a breath that rattled in his chest. He looked at his wife, his children, the faces he'd memorized and would carry with him wherever he was going. And when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but in that silent studio, every word carried like it was being spoken directly into every heart present. "Don't wait," he said. "Don't wait to tell people you love them. Don't wait to forgive. Don't wait to do the things that matter. Don't put off the ordinary moments because you think you'll have time later." He paused, gathered his strength. "You won't. None of us will. We think we have forever, but we only have now. So love people now. Show up now. Be present now." The silence that followed was absolute, not empty, but full of truth, of recognition, of 1,000 people simultaneously realizing that they'd been taking their own ordinary days for granted. Steve Harvey stood slowly, helped Michael to his feet, and did something that would become the image everyone remembered from that day. He embraced him. Not a quick hug, not a performative gesture for the cameras, but a real embrace. The kind that says, "I see you. I honor you. You matter." And as they stood there, this comedian and this dying teacher, surrounded by family and strangers who'd become family, something shifted in that studio. The lights seemed softer. The air seemed clearer. Time seemed to slow down enough that everyone could feel it. The sacredness of being alive, of being together, of being human. When they finally pulled apart, Steve kept his hands on Michael's shoulders, looked him directly in the eyes, and said something that wasn't for the cameras or the audience, but just for this one man who needed to hear it. "You did it right," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion. "You hear me? You did it right. You loved them well. You showed up. You stayed. And that's everything. That's the whole game right there." Michael nodded, tears streaming down his face, and mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." The family helped Michael back to his seat. The audience stood again, applauding not for entertainment but for honor, for respect, for the privilege of having shared space with someone who just taught them how to live by showing them how to die. And as the Thompson family made their way slowly up the aisle, Steve Harvey stood on that stage and watched them go. Watched Michael lean heavily on his wife and children. Watched this ordinary family who'd just done something extraordinary. They'd shown up, been honest, loved out loud, and given the world permission to do the same. The producers were in his ear, asking what to do next, how to salvage the episode, what the plan was, but Steve wasn't listening. He was watching the Thompsons disappear through the studio doors, carrying with them a story that would outlive all of them. And he understood, maybe for the first time in his long career, that this right here was what it had all been for, not the laughs or the ratings or the fame. For moments like this, for the chance to hold space for people's pain and joy and humanity, for the opportunity to remind everyone watching that we're all connected by the simple fact that we love and we lose and we keep going anyway. The studio stayed quiet long after the Thompson family left. People weren't rushing to exits or checking their phones or moving on to the next thing. They were just sitting there, breathing, feeling, letting the moment settle into their bones. Because some things can't be rushed. Some truths need time to take root. And some stories, the ones about ordinary people doing extraordinary things with the time they're given, those are the stories that change us if we're brave enough to let them. Michael Thompson died 3 weeks later. At home, in his own bed, surrounded by his family. Janet was holding his hand. His children were there, each of them touching him. A hand on his shoulder, fingers wrapped around his, foreheads pressed against his. And in those final moments, as his breathing slowed and the space between each breath grew longer, he'd opened his eyes one last time, looked at each of them, and smiled. He'd made it. He'd stayed. He'd loved them all the way to the end. The episode aired 2 days after his funeral. The network had called Janet, asked permission, explained they could pull it if it was too painful. But she'd said no, said Michael would want it shown, said the world needed to see what he'd given them. Within hours, it had been viewed 60 million times. Within days, over 200 million. It became the most watched moment in Family Feud history, not because it was scandalous or shocking, but because it was true, because it reminded people what actually mattered, because it gave everyone permission to stop pretending that life goes on forever and start treating each day like the unrepeatable gift it is. The letters came by the thousands, from children writing to their parents for the first time in years, from husbands and wives who'd been taking each other for granted, who'd watched Michael Thompson fight to stay for his family and realized they'd been wasting the time they had, from people facing their own diagnoses, their own countdowns, who found courage in Michael's peace, from hospice workers and oncologists and chaplains who'd been doing sacred work in shadows, grateful that someone had shown the world what dying with dignity and love actually looked like. A high school history teacher in Minneapolis started a tradition. Every year on the anniversary of that episode airing, he'd show it to his students, not as entertainment, but as education, as a lesson in what it means to live well. Every year, his classroom would fill with teenagers who thought they were invincible, who thought time was infinite, watching an ordinary man teach an extraordinary truth, that how you love people in your ordinary days determines everything about who you really are. Janet Thompson kept Michael's baseball cap, kept the shirt he'd worn that day, kept every card and letter that came addressed to her family from strangers who'd been changed by her husband's story. She started a foundation simple, small, nothing grand, that helped families afford to make final memories together, helped pay for trips to game shows or Disney World or just a weekend at the lake, anywhere that would give them what Michael had given his family, one more day together, one more ordinary, precious, irreplaceable day. Sarah got married 2 years later. She carried a photo of her father in her bouquet, and during the father-daughter dance, the DJ played the audio from that Family Feud episode, Michael's voice, weak but clear, saying, "Don't wait. Love people now." She danced alone in the center of the floor, crying and smiling simultaneously, and everyone there understood that her father had kept his promise. He was there. Maybe not the way she wanted, but there nonetheless. Steve Harvey never forgot that day. He kept a photo on his desk, Michael Thompson, surrounded by his family, all of them on that stage, all of them crying and holding each other. On hard days, when the work felt shallow or the industry felt hollow, Steve would look at that photo and remember what actually mattered. He'd pick up the phone and call his own kids, tell them he loved them, make plans to see them, stop waiting for someday, and choose today instead. He started ending every show the same way. Just a simple reminder, a few words that had become his signature. Don't wait to love the people in your life. Show up. Be present. Because ordinary days are actually the most precious ones. And somewhere out there, in living rooms and hospital rooms and offices and cars, people heard those words and made different choices. Called the parent they'd been meaning to call. Forgave the friend they'd been too proud to forgive. Told someone they loved them before it was too late. Because Michael Thompson, an ordinary high school history teacher from Oregon who loved game shows and his family, had taught the world something that would outlive him. That the measure of a life isn't found in achievements or accolades or the extraordinary moments, but in the steady, daily choice to show up for the people you love, to stay even when it's hard, to be present even when it costs everything. And that changes everything. Before you go, take a moment. Who's the one person you wish could have seen this story? Tag them or tell us their name below, because love doesn't end when a story does. And if this reminded you why kindness still matters, subscribe and share so the world never forgets moments like these. This is Stories Left Behind, where every act of love finds a home.